Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. The Middle East is in the news again. Civilian casualties in Gaza are mounting, and Israeli analysts are talking about mowing the grass to justify their strategy. But who really controls U.S. foreign policy in the region? How did Israel transform from a European colony to a U.S. power projection platform? Let's discuss. Well, welcome to the podcast, Greg and Stephen. I'm excited to have you on our discussion today, especially with what's going on in the Middle East and your latest book on Israel. So I hope you are going to be able to shed some good observations on what is going on there. And for by way of introduction, Stephen is an independent political analyst from Ottawa and author of several acclaimed books, recent books. The Long War in Syria is 2017, a book on Korea's struggle, Patriots, Traitors and Empires, 2018. And the book that I just finished reading, this book here, it's called Israel, Beachhead in the Middle East. And it is an extensive look at Israel. And as I said, very, very timely. So welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Thank you.
Good. So I need to give you a little bit about my background. I know you know Greg very well, and I would call myself a Rachel Maddow liberal who reads the New York Times and and has been taken on a really wonderful ride by my friendship with Greg, and I'm seeing things differently, and it's an exciting part of my transformation. And to that point, your book just completely changed the way in which I thought about the Middle East and the conflict and the history. And it had me reframe that in a very positive way, and I thank you for that. Tell me a little bit about your book. Give me a summary, and let's start talking about Israel and the Middle East.
Okay. Well, I should tell you about the reason the book was written. It was really a book that my publisher, Robin Philpott, who runs Errata Books, asked me to write. And the reason he asked me to write it was because of a concern he shared with me, which was that there was this growing view, or maybe I shouldn't say growing view, but there was a view that U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy, or U.S. Middle East policy had been hijacked by Israel and by the Jewish lobby in the United States. And that was a liberal view. I mean, there's certainly a liberal view. There is Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer who had advanced that thesis quite visibly. And Robin thought or wanted to do a book that examined that argument and refuted it. So that was the raison d'etre for the book. But the way I approached it was, and I like to approach contemporary issues in historical perspective. So I approached it by looking at Zionism, political Zionism, and particularly the problem that political Zionism was trying to address. And I contrasted political Zionism with another movement, which was trying to address the same problem that political Zionism, which was trying to address, namely anti-Semitism. And that alternative movement was one that I called the Movement for Universal Equality, originating in the French Revolution and then extended by the Bolshevik Revolution. So it was a movement that essentially takes the universalism or universal equality that's latent in liberalism and tries to realize it. So I went from that as the origin, looking at, well, really the book was structured around the conflict between those two movements or themes. So Zionism as one approach to resolving the problem of anti-Semitism, and the movement of universal equality as an alternative approach. And then I look at how those two approaches interact with each other over time, looking at the role that Israel plays as well in US foreign policy, and how Israel becomes an instrument of US foreign policy, rather than US foreign policy being an instrument of Israel, as some liberals would like to contend.
And that was, I think, that was my takeaway, a reversal of what I was thinking when I look at this Middle East conflict. It was often defined as these crazy religious people who are can't really be reasoned with. And here we have a democracy in the Middle East. It struggles, but it still is this wonderful democracy. And it's the only anecdote that we have to deal with this mass, hysterical groups of people. But what your book did such a good job with is show how Israel is truly a beachhead. It is truly a jumping off point for our particular interest in the Middle East, our imperialist ambitions, and that the craziness of the Arabs was often those that were in contradiction with our policy. That these were people who had a lot more socialist point of view. They were rejecting our constant expansion that was used in a symbiotic way with Israel and the United States. Did I get that kind of right?
Yes, you did.
And that was,
absolutely.
That's the thing that I think is what was such a nice transformation with your book, and how you laid that out. That it is okay. The Jewish lobby's strong, but the gun lobby's strong. The Chamber of Commerce lobby is strong in this country. I mean, there's a lot of strong lobbies, but to suggest that they are manipulating our foreign policy, we have mutual benefits that are being realized. And
it's interesting, this thing that you're fighting, this notion that there's this Jewish lobby. Most of the polls have shown for a long time that there's either skepticism or absolute rejection of that among the Jewish community itself. The community itself doesn't buy that ultra-Zionist position at all. In fact, the Jewish community, I don't like the word community, but the Jews in America have been among the most progressive elements historically in our political life. And so this kind of thing always, I'm glad Stephen's doing this, because it frames it in an international way in terms of US imperialism and the role of Israel in maintaining that and so on. When I first came around the left in the 60s and 70s, one of the things I learned from the Marxist left was that the US imperialism had these, he calls them beachheads, but they had these cops around the world. Israel was a cop in the Middle East. Iran was a cop in the Middle East for the US. Taiwan was a cop and so on and so forth. And every continent, every area of geopolitical interest had a US cop there. And if I understand Stephen correctly, I think that's kind of the notion that he's putting forward in terms of framing it in terms of US imperialism.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And as I said, I like to look at these things in historical perspective. And if you go back to the history of political Zionism, which was led by Theodor Herzl, who was an Austrian Jew. the latter part of the 19th century. His argument was that if you wanted to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, you needed the support of an imperialist power, because you couldn't just go to Palestine and create a Palestinian or a Jewish state. You'd have to have some kind of sponsorship. So how would the political Zionists secure the sponsorship of an imperialist power? Well, they would do that by offering to act on its behalf. I mean, that was quite clear in the plans of political Zionism, that they were going to become the servant of some political power and be the steward of that imperialist power's interest in West Asia. And so the political Zionists went to all of the capitals of Europe and proposed their plan. Eventually, they managed to enlist the support of the British. And once Israel was established, they then managed to secure the support of the French, who probably provided them with the means and the know-how to develop nuclear weaponry. And then eventually the United States became their principal sponsor. But that has been the theme right from the very birth of political Zionism, was that a Zionist state in the Middle East would look after the interests of its imperialist sponsor. It was always, right from the beginning, intended to be an instrument of imperialism.
Yeah, that was an interesting point about how this wasn't just this, it came from considered, structured reasoning of how are we going to survive, how are we going to have this state work, and Herzl was the one that sort of orchestrated that plan.
How do you fit that into the creation of Israel? I mean, historically, now we're moving forward. It's 1945, and we have this emerging battle between the Zionists that are in Palestine and the British who are fighting them, who are actually resisting because they were the early sponsors. What has changed? And of course, regrettably, I think the Soviet Union was one of the early sponsors of Israel. So what happened in that era?
Well, there was a struggle. The Palestinians had figured out, the Arabs of Palestine had figured out that this Jewish immigration and the British sponsorship of a homeland in Palestine meant that they would be displaced and dispossessed. So the Palestinians struggled against that to the point that the struggle started to become intolerable for the British, who were engaged in a conflict at the time. And so at that point, there's an interesting parallel here between what was going on between the Jewish settlers and the indigenous people of Palestine, and then the colonial power, Britain, and what was happening in the United States, the US history. I mean, right from the birth of the United States, where you have settlers from Europe, settlers from Britain coming to this land in America, and engaged in struggles against the indigenous people. And you have this movement to expand westward beyond the Alleghenies, and the British colonial power saying, we're no longer interested in spending money and suppressing the indigenous people. So what we're going to do is we're going to prevent you from expanding beyond the Alleghenies. And then we have the settlers in the United States rising up against the colonial power, which becomes, the War of Independence. But so you see an exact, well, I wouldn't say exact, but there's a parallel here in Palestine. And you see other parallels elsewhere, for example, in Rhodesia, where you have British settlers in Rhodesia, and the original colonial country, Britain, not wanting to mediate this dispute anymore between its settlers and the indigenous people. And those settlers then rebelling against Britain. Or the other parallel would be with Algeria, with the settlers in Algeria refusing to, follow directives coming from Paris about resolving the struggle that was going on between the indigenous people and the settlers. Mm-hmm. So that's what it was. I mean, it was Palestinians launching a struggle against the designs of the British to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
Well, let me go back to the change in how I view this and how your book helped me change my thoughts on this. I'm a big fan of Sam Harris. I love his podcast. I give him $5 a month per Patriot, and he did a podcast back in 2014 that says why I don't criticize Israel. It was a little Ask Me Anything 14-minute short podcast. And the gist of his theory was that sure, Israel does some bad things, and sure, Israel deserves some criticism. But the bottom line is that they are democracy. And if you look at the Palestinians, they have this religiosity, this viral religiosity that makes them unreasonable to the point that they just they have children in front of them as they're having their weapon, shooting off their rockets, and Israel wouldn't do that. But they are different. They are the other. And I remember listening to that and thinking, boy, he's got a good point. And I re-listened to that podcast a week ago, and I was just appalled at how clearly they are framing this sort of crazy Arab metaphor as a mechanism for doing horrible things. And if you look at the Washington Post today, Nikki Haley is quoted as saying, "We must stand against Israel, against the terrorist." Well, okay, just might as well go home. They're the other. They can't be reasoned with. And what are your thoughts about how that has been framed as a mechanism for this power imbalance that we find ourselves in?
Well, I mean, one of the first questions to ask is, why is it that anyone thinks that Israel is a democracy?
Yeah.
I don't understand why people think Israel is a democracy.
It's a faith-driven ethno state. Yeah.
Yes. So I guess I'm just being a little disingenuous here. I guess the reason they believe that is within certain boundaries, there are elections, and those elections can also involve Palestinians who are are considered Israeli citizens. But I mean, I think to look at Israel, you have to look at the territory that Israel controls. And I mean, if you're a settler colonial state, which is what Israel is, it's always been a settler colonial state. And although some people like to dismiss that now, or not dismiss it, but contest that idea, if you go back to the roots of political Zionism, all of the political Zionists were quite clear that they were engaged in a project of settler colonialism. They didn't try to hide that fact. They were quite upfront about it. So it's a settler colonial state. So there are two things you can do in settler colonialism. Either you can have a non-democratic state in which the minority, which are the settlers, rule or regard the natives as second-class citizens, and don't provide them with a political voice, which was done in certain places such as South Africa. Or you can construct a majority for your ethnic group. And that's what the Zionists chose to do. They chose to create a majority within a certain territory. So they have as of 1967, they had control of all of historic Palestine, including the Golan Heights. And within that territory, what they've kind of done is gerrymandered this territory where there is a Jewish majority. And within that territory, there is suffrage. And so they can say, well, we have a democracy because within this territory, we have elections and political parties. But there's also another part of that territory, the territory that they control, which they call what the disputed territories or the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. These are still under Israeli control, but they are denied suffrage. So the only way in which they can have the so-called Jewish democracy is through this process of demographic engineering. They had to engineer a majority. And initially, in 1947, 1948, the way they engineered the demographic majority was through a process of ethnic cleansing, of expelling as many Palestinians as they possibly could, and then preventing their repatriation.
And that was a plan that was clear. Didn't we just find out more facts about that in the last month or so, that was an absolute policy made clear at the beginning, that that's what they were going to be doing, expelling as many as they can and trying to control the democratic process through
and
very aggressive gerrymandering.
Yeah, the Israeli historian I.M. Pape wrote a famous book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine about that. But so this idea that there's a democracy, some have pointed out, yeah, it's a democracy for Jews in an Arab state, or not, in a Jewish state for the Arabs, or what others have called a Herrenvolk democracy, a democracy for the master race, or for one particular ethnic group to the exclusion of others. But if you talk about democracy, it's interesting. In 1947, before the UN introduced its plan to partition Palestine, there were a group of people who we could say were partisans of this movement for universal democracy. In fact, they were communists. And they met, the so-called Commonwealth Parties Conference met in 1947. And they wrote an analysis, a very brief analysis of what was going on in Palestine, which, if I read today, was very insightful and still resonates to this day. Back in 1947, they said that the United States planned to exploit Palestine as a strategic base to protect its interests in the Middle East against the interests and the rights of the peoples of the Middle East. And they said that the United States and Britain were using Zionism in pursuit of a policy to divide and rule, to pit Jews against Arabs. They went on to say that Zionism seeks to make Palestine a Jewish state as an ally of imperialist powers and as their outpost in the Middle East.
Beachhead.
Now, yeah, or apropos of that, Netanyahu, in a book he wrote, described Israel as an outpost of the West. They also said that Zionism puts Jews in the position of being an instrument of imperialist powers in the Middle East in opposition to the struggles for national liberation. And they added that Zionism diverts Jewish people from the real solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. The real solution, in their view, wasn't to separate Jewish people, in this kind of, some say, taking the Jewish ghetto from Europe and placing it in someone else's land in Palestine. That the real solution was along the lines of democratic development and full equality of rights within the countries in which they live. So that was the other view of how you address the problem of anti-Semitism, not by separating Jews from Europe, but by creating democratic societies where everyone has the same rights. And what they proposed for Palestine was the creation of an independent and democratic Palestinian state, which would guarantee equal rights of citizenship with full religious freedom and full opportunities to develop their culture to all inhabitants, Arabs and Jews. So, I mean, when people say, you know, Israel is a democratic state, we might ask, well, you might think it's a democratic state, but what about a state which is a unitary state, a state for Arabs and Jews where all people have the same rights, which is a democratic, that would be a truly democratic state, would it not? Far more democratic than one in which only provides democracy to some, you know, to within an ethnic, only in the case where you have a majority of Jews are you providing a democracy, and then you're providing a Jewish state for everyone else.
Right, right.
In fact, one of the groups, Palestinian groups, which is dismissed and demonized as a terrible terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is regarded officially as a terrorist group by the US government and many Western governments. Mm-hmm. What's its program for Palestine? Its program is to establish a secular democracy on the land of historic Palestine with equality for all of its peoples, all of the people who live there, Arabs and Jews. That seems to me to be a model of democracy. That would be a democratic state. What people call Israel, or what Israel is far from a democratic state, at least in my estimation.
Right, right. The other insight that you provided me with your book was, again, going back to this Sam Harris of these sort of, you know, crazy religious people that can't be reasoned with. In fact, it's this new conservative religious groups in Israel that are pushing this politics. It would almost call them Jewish ISIS. You know, they're very fundamentalists. They think that God gave them the land. They're very rigid in their thinking, and that group is the ones that are really driving some of these horrible Jim Crow policies and dehumanizing the Palestinians, because it comes from this foundational religious belief. Did I describe that correctly?
I might disagree with you a bit about that one. I mean, okay. Political Zionism was never a religious movement. It was always a secular movement, and it was a secular movement founded by secular Jews, who most of them had, in fact, when political Zionism arose, most Jews had abandoned Judaism as a religion. Mm-hmm. But Judaism as a religion has evolved and grown stronger within Israel over time. And it has been used as a justification for Israel. And I think one of the reasons for that is this: Zionism collapses if there's no anti-Semitism. Zionism depends on the existence of anti-Semitism. If you can point to a world in which anti-Semitism has been overcome, then Zionism collapses. Mm-hmm. As an argument. And the consequence of that is that Zionists always have to point to anti-Semitism being rampant somewhere, or if it's not rampant, then it's latent. In fact, even Herzl had argued that anti-Semitism exists in every country. It can never be overcome, it's permanent, and if you can't see it, that's only because it's latent, and something will bring it to the fore. But it's difficult to make that argument that there is a widespread, rampant anti-Semitism, especially if you're a US Jew, because Jews in the United States are the most successful ethno-religious minority in the United States. there may be some anti-Semitism, but it's at a very low level, and American Jews have thrived. So it's difficult, therefore, to point to anti-Semitism as a problem that justifies Zionism. So once you address that problem, you come upon the weakness of Zionism, which is, you could say, okay, well, fine. If you believe that anti-Semitism exists and that Zionism is a solution, and you want to pursue that as a solution to anti-Semitism, that's fine. Just as long as in pursuing that solution, you do not abrogate the rights of other people. You do not dispossess other people, but that's what Zionism does. It dispossesses Palestinians. So how do you deal with that problem? Well, the way to deal with that problem is to suggest that you're not dispossessing them because, in fact, you are the one that was dispossessed, and you're simply reclaiming land that belongs to Jews. And so now you have what was a secular movement now suddenly invoking these arguments from the Bible to say that Jews have some legitimate historical claim to the land of Palestine.
So it's not crazy religiosity. It's crazy Zionism using this friction as a way of deriving power and.
No, it's really about land. I mean, I think to simplify it, it comes down to countering the argument in this country that they're all crazy religious nuts with the notion that it really is about land. It's really about a nation, creating a nation. And it's interesting because this beachhead notion or police notion that I put forward, this notion that Israel is a tool of US imperialism, I think is fundamentally correct. And I think Stevens exposes that very well. But there's an aspect to these colonial these folks that take over a country like Palestine or the United States, or I'm sorry, the indigenous people here, or South Africa, the indigenous people there, and so on and so forth. They become themselves imperialist countries. Their designs then are upon people around them. And I think that's what you see, the contradiction, what's fed this Mersheimer view and the liberal view that the tail is wagging the dog is the fact that someone like Netanyahu comes to the United States during the Obama administration and says, I don't have to talk to the president, goes right to the Congress, and he just exercises muscles. And I think that's because of the imperialist element in Israel. They have their own goals, independent of being a watchdog for the United States. And I think that's expressed very clearly. I mean, Biden now is a little bit embarrassed because people are pressuring him to do something and doesn't want to do anything. But Netanyahu says, I'll do what I want to do. I'll stop when I want to stop. And there's an arrogance to this element because these settler colonial countries develop their own imperial interests. They want more land. They want more of what they think belongs to them. Just as South Africa did when it invaded Namibia, when it invaded Angola. They want to influence the entire region. And just as the United States did when it became a mature capitalist imperialist country as well.
Power imbalance in Gaza is so remarkably distorted. And it is, I don't know about a better term than Jim Crow, but you have almost no electricity. Medicine is rationed. People's mobility is not only restricted but constantly hassled as a way of poor life expectancy, malnutrition. What's the unemployment rate? 50-60% of youth. So to then suggest that this is a kind of a both sides and let's get along, it's not a both sides. It's a remarkably distorted power balance that people don't talk about. I don't know. That's how I'm seeing it. What are your thoughts about that, Stephen?
Well, I was thinking of an analogy to explain this. And the analogy I was thinking of is, imagine that Greg tells me that, or that I want to go to your house and I want to take over your house, and I'm going to relegate you to your basement, and I'm going to live throughout the rest of your house. And Greg is going to give me weapons that allow me to keep you in the basement. And while I'm there, Greg's asking me to take 50% of your income and to remit it to him. So that's a nice analogy of what's going on.
Yeah.
And Greg is the United States. I'm the Zionists, the Israelis, and you're a Palestinian. So now you ask the question, well, why can't I get along, or why can't you get along with me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, it's pretty simple why you can't get along with me. Is because
Right. And when you strike back, it's like you're a terrorist. You're the terrorist in the basement when you do get frustrated and strike out.
Yes, you become the terrorist. But it also, I mean, I don't think that many people in the West really understand the relationship between Israel and the United States, or between me and Greg. Greg's giving me my weapons that allows me to live in your house, and I'm giving him something in return. And obviously, I'm not manipulating Greg, because I think one of the things that we don't realize is that a Jewish state on stolen land can't survive in the Arab world without imperialist support. And that's something that Israelis and Zionists have recognized right from the start. Mm-hmm. And that works out well for Washington, because Washington gets Israel to do its bidding in return for protection. It makes the Jewish state dependent upon the United States. And Israel does very many services to the United States. And that was one of the points of the book, was to look at the services that Israel has done from decade after decade after decade for the United States, most of which are never recognized. Mm-hmm. I mean, for example, the two great services that Israel has done for the United States. One, it destroyed the nuclear reactor at Ozark in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And it destroyed a nuclear reactor in Syria in 2007. If Iraq or Syria had developed a nuclear weapons capability, there's no way the United States would have ever toppled the Saddam government in Iraq. And there's no way it would have been able to march into Syria, as it's done, and occupy 1/3 of the country. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the Israelis have recognized that. If those countries had nuclear weapons, there's no way the United States would be able to dominate the Middle East to the extent that it has. Now, these are great services that the Israelis have done. Only one of many, many services that Israelis have provided to either the United States or to France and Britain in the 1950s, when France and Britain were their sponsors.
And cheap. I mean, how many billion do we spend? I mean, a lot of bang for the buck. We don't spend that much. I mean, in relationship to other countries, maybe, but what is it? 3 billion a year? That's not much.
3.8 billion, I think, per year in Toronto. And the important thing to recognize that's about as what you'd spend on a carrier strike group per year. So it's about the equivalent of investing in one carrier strike group. But also what's not recognized is that who does that money go to? They say it's aid to Israel. Well, it's really aid to the US arms manufacturers, because that's who it goes to. It buys arms from the US military industrial complex that are then sent to Israel. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice subsidy for shareholders and investors in US weapons manufacturers.
Tell me about your thoughts about, with the latest conflict in Gaza, isn't this the very first time there's a crack in this sort of solidarity towards Israel? I mean, it it's Huffington Post had a headline of, this was an anomaly to have certain politicians criticizing Israel. This is new, isn't it? And where is this going?
Yeah, I know that's the view. I haven't been as optimistic as other people have been. Because to me, this is the latest iteration. We've seen this happen in Gaza before. Gaza gets beat up for what? How many days does it go on?
10.
And there are expressions of moral outrage around the world and indignation. And the Israelis lose what credibility they have. And then there's a ceasefire, and everyone forgets about what happened until the next time this happens, and they get beat up. And then there are some more moral, expressions of moral outrage. And if you've seen this happen time after time after time, it just seems to be the same film over and over. But then there are people who are encountering this for the first time. So I went to a rally a few days ago, and it was supposed to be a vigil outside the Israeli embassy. And most of the people there were younger people. Most of them were Palestinian or Arab. But what struck me was the views of the people at the rally, because they subscribe to this view of capitalist society, the pluralist view of capitalist society, which essentially holds that the state is neutral, and there are a whole bunch of groups within the society, and they pressure the state, and the state acts on the basis of, it tries to accommodate these multiple pressures. So you saw people with, urging others to write their representative, to put pressure on the government to do whatever. What in the United States, what is it, to withdraw weapons and military aid to Israel. But I think one of the problems with that view, well, there's a problem with the pluralist view of U.S. society. Or of any kind of capitalist society, one that holds that the state is independent. And the more realistic view is that the state is heavily influenced by those who own and control the economy. And that you can put pressure on the state from the streets, and if you have enormous pressure, the state might react and the state may bend, but for the most part, it's not going to happen simply by sending a letter to your congressman or senator. And what's required, I think, is some kind of sophisticated understanding of sophisticated understanding of the state, the forces which control the state, and the relationship between the US state and the Israeli state, and what role the Israeli state serves within US foreign policy. Because once you understand that, then you might have a more effective way of changing the world. And I think the way in which people are trying to change the world now is not particularly effective, because it's not predicated on any kind of sophisticated understanding of the way in which their societies work, and the way in which power is distributed, and the way in which it's exercised, and the role that Israel plays within US foreign relations.
Right, right. And I think that's the main takeaway from your book, that these themes, these expressions of Israel's just defending itself. It's has a right to exist. It has a right to that. Those politicians have got a lot of mileage out of those, but the reality is there's a very clear symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship for our own interests that are secondary to just wanting to have wonderful Jeffersonian democracy blossom all over the Middle East. That's not what's going on. It's an extension of our intrusive imperialistic ambitions. That's how I saw it. And I don't know. What do you think, Greg?
Well, I think the missing word here is capitalism. I mean, it's that's what's driving U.S. foreign policy. It isn't our foreign policy. It's the foreign policy of capitalism in the United States. And so it actually is against our interest. I mean, what our politicians do is against the people's interest in the United States. And that's the message we have to try to convey. And there are many ways of doing it. And I largely agree with Stephen in terms of that's the deeper understanding. We can't always rely on the deeper understanding in a country like the United States because the media is distorted things so very badly. Mm-hmm. So I welcome, all the different approaches that bring people to a greater awareness of what this is. But in the end, I agree with Stephen. Until you talk about capitalism and the role capitalism plays in terms of determining this policy, you're pissing in the wind. I mean, it's you're really not going to get anywhere. Look, I mean, what you see now as a new enlightenment or people realizing the role, I think it comes from the squad. It comes from these so-called progressive Democrats. They're essentially forced into saying something. I mean, they lose all credibility if they don't speak to this. So yeah, that seems different, but is it really different because it's kind of forced on them? So yeah, let's welcome that, and let's hope that spawns a lot of young people looking hard at it, reading Stephen's book. But in the end, it's capitalism.
Yeah. It's Lucy and the football. It just is it constantly. You have so much hope, but ultimately Lucy pulls the football back from Charlie Brown. That's kind of my frustration with this. And you're right too, Greg, is that one of the issues is how do you get good information, and you don't through the New York Times and through cable news, and you have to get it through other means, which, by the way, Stephen, your blog is just wonderful. You are so prolific with all of your topics and timely, and I'll strongly recommend. I'm going to link to your blog and your book and the notes on this podcast. It's something that everybody should subscribe to. So and you've had that for what, 5-6 years or more, long time.
Yeah. So long. Yeah. 20 years, I think.
20. Oh.
The years go by.
They do. They do.
I noticed that you have a couple of criticisms of Noam Chomsky with his not being this anti-imperialist. That always puts a knife in my heart when Greg sends me articles criticizing my wonderful Noam, but he deserves it, I think, periodically. So
well, yeah, and it's not only him. Who was it I noticed recently? It just struck me that there's still this notion within the U.S., even among progressives, that the United States has a role to play in the affairs of other people. Mm-hmm. So you'll see, usually when I disagree with Chomsky, that's one of the reasons, is that he thinks that the United States has a role to play. For example, what was his latest one was that the United States should intervene in Syria on behalf of the Kurds to help them establish some kind of anarchist homeland within someone else's territory. Mm-hmm. But I see there's this, it's almost implicit, this implicit view that, well, I mean, I think it could be criticized on two grounds, but the implicit view that the United States can be a force of good in the world. And you could criticize that on the grounds that it cannot, because it's in a capitalist, imperialist country. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it might if it wasn't. But there's still this notion that of a mission that the United States has. And this mission idea seems to have permeated US society almost entirely, that Americans have a mission in the world. And he certainly seems to embrace that view. Even though perhaps he doesn't even know he has that view.
Yeah, yeah.
We're lucky to have Chomsky establish a podium in the United States. It's so difficult for anyone on the left to be allowed into the media box, the establishment media. And Chomsky's one of the few that's allowed in from time to time. So we're lucky about that, and I admire the fact that occasionally Chomsky sneaks in some very good things on MSNBC and other places. The truth is, a consistent anti-imperialist, a consistent anti-capitalist, and consistent pro-socialist never will be in that box, never get into that box. So we have to fight like hell to get Stephen's book out and Stephen out in front of people, just as we did with Michael Parenti, one of the most prolific writers, one of the best writers we've seen in our lifetime. Yet he can't get an academic position in America, in the United States.
And he has similar, very good criticisms of, he's okay. He starts with the caveat of this guy has a brilliant mind, is a photographic memory. The facts are always in line. I agree 95%, but the 5% that he disagrees is exactly what you're saying, Stephen. Just this kind of defaulting to America first, to the power we exert in other parts of the country that's often an imbalance too. And he has some very good criticisms too. So I'm mad at Noam Chomsky because Greg and I sent him an invitation to be on our podcast and he hasn't responded back. So he's on my bad list until he does. So.
Well, he does have a lot of good stuff, and sometimes people take exception to me citing anything that he does, because there's some people who loathe him so thoroughly. But he does, I mean, and I've cited him and quoted him in the book we're talking about right now.
Right. Favorably, yeah.
Yes, and he had some good arguments to make there. But often he disappoints people terribly because he seems to be quite inconsistent. But you're talking about Parenti. And interestingly, last night I was reading an article that was written by Parenti, I think somewhere around 1990, in which he was complaining about Chomsky and saying, look at Chomsky is celebrated as a person who's championing socialism, socialist views, and criticism of the media and so more of the sophisticated analyses of US society and US foreign policy. And yet anything that he's saying has been said before him by others who are ignored for whatever reason, and probably for the reasons that Greg already mentioned. But that was, in my early, more than 20 years ago, when I first encountered Chomsky, and I was not well versed in the work of, well, say, Marxist-Leninists. And I started reading the works of Marxist-Leninists. After reading the works of Chomsky, I was suddenly struck that anything that Chomsky was saying had been said by others before him. And perhaps in many respects, in much more eloquently and much more cogently and much more articulately. But these are people that we rarely talk about anymore, if we ever really notice to begin with.
Right. Well, Stephen, this has just been a real pleasure. And I want to thank you for putting a little ammonia under my nose and making me wake up a little bit. And that's one of my great joys in as I get older, is changing my opinion and thinking differently. And you really helped me do that. And your book is just foundationally a must if people want to understand what's going on with Israel, and it looks at it from such why it should be unique. I don't know. It seems obvious after you read it, your perspective. So thank you so much. Any other topics in your new books now that you're retired and able to be a little more productive? What's your next work?
The book that I have a commission to write is called Capitalism, well, something like, I don't know what we're going to call it, Capitalism in Pandemics. It might be something like Capitalism as a Comorbidity or something, or
Right.
The Pathology of Capitalism. But there are a lot of interesting themes and ideas about the COVID pandemic and how it has evolved and how countries have reacted to it and the role that capitalism has played.
Yeah, I would recommend people go to your blog, your recent article about that, about how countries respond differently to the epidemic based on whether or not they're capitalists, and often those that are not have been much more successful. That was a very good article and a lot of detail, and that would be a good place to start. I just finished the new Michael Lewis book, Premonition.
Oh, so did I.
Yeah, and I thought he did a good job in saying this wasn't just the fact that Trump is, horrible and deplorable and incompetent and, all of that. The foundation for our inability to respond to this were well established systemically within our system. And then Trump has just put the icing on top of the cake. He didn't help, but moving a lot of the positions of authority away from civil servants to political, and how within our systems we failed. We need to revise our system, and so that'll be a good book for you. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
And this has been a real pleasure. And if I'm in Ottawa, I'm gonna expect that you're going to buy me a cup of coffee if I get close to you. Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Great
Bye
seeing
now.
you, Stephen.
Okay.
Thanks
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.